Hey everyone, I'm Anne Marie Doherty, the CEO of the Bob Woodruff Foundation. Thank you for joining our first Veterans on Wall Street event in 2022. Our mission at the Bob Woodruff Foundation is to find, fund, shape, and accelerate equitable solutions that help our veterans, service members, their families, and caregivers thrive. Our work across the country provides programming and resources to ensure veterans have access to the tools needed to succeed long after their time in uniform. In many cases, this support starts with a career transition from the military into the civilian workforce. In just a few minutes, our panelists will share much more about that transition moment, as well as other transitions veterans and military spouses often undergo throughout their careers. Our partnership with Veterans on Wall Street spans more than 10 years. The Bob Woodruff Foundation is very proud to be the strategic charity partner of VOWS. And I'm really grateful for the life-changing work we've been able to do together over the last decade. And the challenges we face together and continue to face supporting a networking and hiring program in the midst of a global pandemic over the past couple of years was no small feat. And I just really want to thank our VOWS partners. To all of you, thank you for your commitment to our partnership. I'm going to ask you all to continue to be a strong ally as we wade through the uncertainties of world conflict. Like I'm sure all of you, we are actively monitoring the situation in Ukraine. It's heartbreaking. This is a very difficult moment for a lot of you. And I know we've got troops deployed to Europe. We've got their families here at home that we're all thinking about. And at the Bob Woodruff Foundation, we remain committed to our grantees and partners. We're going to continue to go above and beyond to ensure America's heroes are taken care of because that's what they deserve. Again, thank you to all of you, all the VOWS members for your partnership. Thank you for your dedication. Thank you for making a difference for U.S. service members and their families. And thank you for taking the time out of your day to join today's conversation. And with that, please join me in welcoming one of our sponsors at Union Square Advisors, Marine veteran Jono Peters. John, over to you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Welcome to today's panel discussion, Expanding the Pie, Widening the Definition of Transition. I'm Jono Peters, a former Marine who left the service in 2015 and was fortunate to find a seat in Citigroup's leverage finance team. The team at Citi was remarkable, and I was certainly the beneficiary of years of experience of the firm's focus on hiring veterans, but was the beneficiary even more so of the recognition that veterans are impact players on Wall Street and elsewhere. I believe, as do so many others, that our experiences make us unique. While working at Citi, I was able to use the GI Bill to complete my MBA at UVA's Darden School of Business, which I viewed as a tool to help complete my transition out of the service. The GI Bill is an extremely important asset that I would recommend every veteran utilize or at least consider. After 6 years at Citi and 8 months ago, I was approached by Union Square Advisors to further build out their capital markets platform, where we have since enjoyed tremendous success in advising technology companies on capital market solutions in a variety of financing scenarios. I'm very excited to bring the VOWS network to Union Square, another firm who's committed to supporting and hiring veterans. My experience as a Marine is one I remain extremely proud of, and it certainly armed me with the tools I need to be successful. On behalf of all of us at Union Square Advisors, we're proud to partner with VOWS and the Bob Woodruff Foundation. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce Meg Harrell, Chief Programs Officer at the Bob Woodruff Foundation, who will be moderating today's panel.
Thank you, Jono. As Anne-Marie said, the Bob Woodruff Foundation is proud to be the strategic philanthropic partner of VOWS. In my capacity as Chief Program Officer, I'm responsible for overseeing all of the Foundation's grant-making activities across our Got Your Six network. Many of these grants touch on issues related to employment. We know there have been great strides towards ensuring veterans find employment post-service. Veteran unemployment hit a 20-year low in 2019 at 3.1%. During the pandemic, unemployment for veterans surged to a high of nearly 12%, but was back down to 4.4% in 2021. However, there are portions of the military and veteran community that continue to struggle to find fruitful employment. This is part of why the foundation especially focuses on employment services for certain populations, such as vulnerable veterans, middle enlisted and junior enlisted veterans, and military and veteran spouses. In addition to funding direct employment services, BWF grants aim to reduce barriers to employment by resolving legal issues, promoting housing stability, and ensuring access to mental health care and basic needs. Employment intersects with these other social determinants of health, and to successfully achieve and maintain gainful employment, more vulnerable veterans may require a range of services to address their underlying needs. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's impressive panelists. Steph Drake is the Executive Director of the Bob Woodruff Foundation's grantee Next Stop. Next Stop is a best-in-class organization that trains and places high-performing middle enlisted military leaders into industry careers. Jared Lyon, a longtime friend of the foundation and staunch advocate for student veterans, who is the National President and CEO of Student Veterans of America. Eddie Menser, the Associate Director for Strategic Initiatives at the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Military, Community, and Family Policy. And Dr. Danny Perkins, esteemed researcher and Bob Woodruff Foundation thought partner, who is a principal scientist and professor at Pennsylvania State University. Each of our panelists bring unique expertise to today's conversation, and I know we're going to learn a lot from them. Steph, I think I'm going to start with you. So your program focuses specifically on middle enlisted veterans. I mentioned them as one of the areas that the Bob Woodruff Foundation is especially concerned in and focused on. What should employers know about that population?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. So we do. We focus entirely on middle enlisted, which we use E3 to E7 for those that are familiar with the rank structure. And that population typically represents 22 to 28, maybe 30-year-old who's got significant real-world experience as part of the military, has undoubtedly learned at least 2 new skills that they didn't know before joining, has been to a ton of training. The DoD is well known for being a training entity, right? Often technical aptitude, if not likely. And last but not least, leadership. And I could go on and on with all the different skill sets, but when you compare to peers, this 22-year-old is not just a typical high school graduate. However, from a resume perspective, they may appear that way, right? And so, unlike officers, I've had the privilege of leading young Marines and seeing their talent firsthand in the military space. And then when we both hit the street to try our hand in the civilian world, I've got a degree to fall back on, at least 1 university network, maybe 2 for officers and even staff and COs. And our young service members just don't have that yet. And so they don't have the network to leverage. They don't know the jargon to use in the civilian world. And actually what we learn is most of them it's so much of this, I don't know what I don't know. And that's what we do. And we serve to bridge that gap for that population. And the other thing I would end with here is that this population is actually the bulk of the transitioning veteran population. So officers and staff and COs, highly talented, very skilled, typically very well educated as well, and can fit right into organizations pretty easily. But they're actually not, they're like 20% of the transitioning veteran population every year at most. 80% of that population is really in this young enlisted space with so much opportunity, but not the easy target necessarily or easy to understand group for companies. And likewise, these young service members don't understand companies and industries either.
Danny, we know from your studies and your data that the story you tell about from the data bears out that not everybody has an easy transition into employment. So what can you tell us? What are the numbers telling us about that transition?
That's a great question, Megan. Thanks for having me. I just want to first start off by tagging on to Steph's point, right? So we actually see that leadership, when we look at underemployment in our data, which we have 61% of veterans reporting underemployment. And then when we look at some objective measures of that, which is things like how many of those folks that are reporting underemployment switch jobs and how often, right? And the objective measures tell the story that their perceptions of being underemployed seem to be real, right? And when we look at, say, are they underemployed because of the skills? Are they underemployed because of their education? Or are they underemployed based on their leadership? What we see most often is it has a lot to do with skills and leadership. And that it makes sense in one way, because we know civilian employers have some understanding of the education side of the house, right? And so they understand when you have a degree what that means often. Of course, when it's from Penn State, it means so much more. But also when you think about things like skills, and Steph said, on average 2 skills, I'm sure she was underinflating that. I would venture to guess we would be talking about 4 or 5 skills, quite frankly. But secondly, leadership, as we dug into our data on underemployment, we saw folks reporting far and away the most area they totally feel underutilized is their leadership, which causes what we would say job turnover, which for a company, as we know, is helpful. If you're going to spend that kind of time on training and getting a person involved, and then they're transitioning out because they're not feeling like their leadership is being used. So for me, one of the lessons learned that when we talk to employers is you really need to understand the leadership, meaning you need to talk to that individual to understand what kind of leadership skills they're bringing. Because more often than not, you don't have an understanding of that. And so I think that's really critical as part of thinking about employment and underemployment. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to take that and go right back to Steph, because Steph, one of the strengths of your program is that you've developed strong partnerships with an industry. You're located in Houston. You've got that relationship with the oil and gas industry. How have you worked with your partners to address those concerns that Danny is seeing veterans express? A lot of our audience today is from the financial field. So what should they know? What are the takeaways?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, a couple of key successes or things to look at, and, openly still growing in this space. Not all companies are in the same place in the evolution on this, and that's okay. But one would be to identify and leverage your existing veteran population. It sounds like an easy thing, but really that's a great first step to take. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Second, I would say, make sure you identify any unintentional barriers. And we just heard a little bit about that from the underemployment space, but sometimes veterans aren't even applying to your jobs. And it's because your job description says you have to have 2 years of experience in the financial industry, right? And they don't. And so you're automatically writing off all of those candidates. And veterans, much like women, are more likely to look at a job description, see the 14 things that say they're required or listed, and go, gosh, I only have 12 of those. I'm not qualified. I've seen my own husband do it with 2 degrees. He's an artillery guy in the Marine Corps, and he's done that. And so many veterans do that because in our world, we're used to, you have to have everything before you put in your package for promotion or whatever it may be. Right. So you're losing candidates purely by your job description, and you're not even intending to do that. Right. So we work one-on-one with companies to help them understand that and identify other ways to say, but if you're a veteran, maybe look at these, do you have these skill sets or background? And then lastly, I would say, intentional engagement with, really the right entities. So whether it's the right nonprofits like us, the right military installations, but we just talked about the spectrum of this veteran population. And, I know Eddie is itching to talk about the spouse population as well, but it's really varied. So you have young enlisted that are doing things like shooting artillery. You actually have young enlisted that are doing financial management, right? And everything in between. And then, on the officer side, it gets a little more compressed, but they're not all at every installation, and the ones at every installation are not all transitioning. So instead of maybe trying to go broad brush, especially as you're starting out, identify the right partners to help you figure out where do you focus your energy. So I think that's probably the three biggest things. And you're going back to that, identify and leverage your existing veteran population. A couple of key things there. There's no one else on your team that wants really high quality veterans more than your existing veterans. They don't want just any veterans. They want the best ones. And I've seen it done so well, pull them in, have them pre-screen some applications. They may give some back to that poor recruiter who doesn't understand this background and say, hey, these three are worth looking at more, maybe give them some recommendations on a nonprofit or other entity that can help them mold their resume to something we can understand, right? Pull them into the interviews. Seen a company do that. They just had a veteran on the VRG that sat in on a series of interviews, and at the end they were able to say, here's what so-and-so was trying to tell you, and that was good, right? Or be able to help bridge that gap. So many different ways to do it, and every company is different, so it's going to be a mix for everyone.
Thanks, Steph. That's really interesting. I'm especially intrigued by the idea of pulling in one of the veterans you already have in-house into the interviews. So, Jared, I'm looking at your little square. We talk about all these transitioning veterans. The bulk of them are middle enlisted. They're not all toning up their resumes, though. Some of them are going off to school. And you've given a really interesting pitch that I've heard a number of times about how those veterans that go to school first or second after their military service should be especially appealing to employers. So I'm gonna toss it to you.
Appreciate it, Meg. Thanks so much. And as we kind of think about this population, I love to start off with a full disclosure. I am that junior enlisted person. The highest rank I ever achieved while on active duty was E5. And so when we started look at this population, there's lots of good conversation that's been had, and I agree with it broadly, but I'd like to provide some insights with regard to particularly the underemployment conversation and how our data demonstrated a deeper understanding to that population relative to the pandemic. And so we know that when we look at the transitioning force, there's really multiple transitions that will happen inside of that first about 6 years from taking the uniform off. We hear about it a lot with regard to veterans might not stay at their first job for very long, that they're looking for what that fit is, and they may try multiple things on along that way. But what we know is actually the majority of the transitioning force is going to be, as Steph described, that more junior portion of the force. And of those non-retirees that separate from the military, they're mostly going to do one of two things when they get out, and it's nearly 80% of them will do this. It's not stay by the base. And so it's one of the reasons that we find that recruitment at the base or talking at the base, it'll bias your results towards retirees or commissioned officers. That's not a bad thing. I just want to point out that you're looking at an artificially narrow scope of the entirety of the experience. But where does everybody go? Well, those one of two things, they return home to where they are from, where their significant other is from. And keep in mind, we have to broaden that definition to not only spouse, especially for younger Americans. Family is dynamic, and it depends on how somebody defines it. That all notwithstanding, when they get home, they start working. But what we know is they also start school. And when they start school, it makes it particularly difficult because about 67% of veterans that'll use the GI Bill to complete a bachelor's degree, so I'm talking about primarily enlisted, they start at community college. But the majority of them don't turn on when they do that. You would think, geez, why aren't they using this great GI Bill? Well, the reason is because it is this great benefit. And veterans over time have realized two things about transitioning to community college. First is that it's very affordable. It's how community college was designed. And so paying out of pocket at community college preserves your GI Bill for the more expensive bachelor's degree and then ultimately graduate degree or beyond. And secondly, community colleges historically have had a better opportunity to provide prior military credit for current learning credit. So they're building up a transcript, which makes them more likely, if you find them at the undergraduate level, to be transfer students. That's exactly my story. It's how I got out of the Navy, was via community college. But when we ultimately look at that population, what we know is what jobs they're doing while they're back in school. And the two primary industries that you'll find student veterans working, we define that as a veteran using or have gone back to school, not necessarily using benefits, because not all veterans that go back to school are using their benefits. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But if they're back in school, we know that about 70% of the population is working full or part-time while they're going back to school in two industries, retail and service. So during the pandemic, which industries did we see jobs suffer in most quickly, most rapidly? It's retail and service. We found out something else that is kind of silly, but is law. Do you know that if a veteran, their previous employer was the Department of Defense in uniform, within their first 24 months of separating from active duty, they're ineligible to receive federal unemployment benefits if they're using their GI Bill. And so we had this whole group of veterans who lost their jobs while working in school. And why are they working? Half of them are married with kids and another 20% are single parents. The GI Bill is generous, but it doesn't cover all our living expenses. And so they're starting to look for, geez, do I have to drop out of school to be able to receive unemployment? Well, I find myself in this really difficult way. Now in 2020, we were able to work with members of Congress and the administration to put a pause on that. So essentially the Department of Labor didn't enforce that part of it so that that population could receive it. And we passed the law inside of 11 days, which was lightning speed, but everything was important during the pandemic. And that was to preserve veterans' benefits as they transitioned from in-person learning to online. But ultimately, that underemployment, it can be inflated because you're looking at nearly 600,000 of the recently transitioned are working while they're going to school. They're just working in jobs that are not necessarily aligned with what they did in the military, because they're working a job that supports their academic schedule while putting food on the table for their families. And the thing that's really difficult about that, it's the last point, is the top three majors that student veterans are graduating with at the undergraduate level are business, STEM, and health-related fields. Hugely in-demand career fields that accounts for 52% of all student veterans that graduate at an undergraduate level on the GI Bill. And yet they're working in things like retail or service. So they're going to make a third transition when they graduate college. And oddly, that transition is going to be, I was on active duty maybe 6 years. I was in college for 6 years while working in retail. And now I'm trying to find an accounting job. And I didn't take an internship because I couldn't afford to do that while also taking school off. And so what we look for employers to sort of understand is that a really great source of recruitment in non-degreed roles is actually America's college and university campuses. And especially if the employers could think, how do I want to try to ultimately retain this force long-term? You could look for non-degreed roles in disciplines such as business, STEM, and health-related fields, where veterans as students could be working in those roles that when they graduate and now have their degree, they could make an ultimate transition into that company once they've got their degree. This is particularly important for our junior enlisted force.
Jared, I've heard you say before, though, that not all veterans think about somebody who is 6 years out of uniform as a veteran.
So it's nuanced, right? And so a lot of private sector employers that define veteran status, it comes from something called protected veteran status, which is defined by VEVRA, which is a portion of law codified in 1974, and it's been modified a handful of times. But it gives you 4 categories. And the primary reason that VEVRA defines it is under OFCCP and the Department of Labor, their enforcement of government contracts. So it requires a certain percentage of a workforce to be veteran. And it ebbs and flows every year, but give or take around 5-6% is what the kind of current look is. But when you look at the 4 categories, they're pretty straightforward. Veteran with a disability, so that's a disability rating assigned by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Campaign badges or expeditionary medals, that means you served during time of war and deployed. Armed Forces medal, so that means you served during time of war but didn't necessarily deploy. Or the 4th category, which was added in the Cold War era when we weren't at war, and that was a veteran within 3 years of separating from active duty. The thing is, it's nuanced and it's difficult. And when we then complicate things by the work opportunity tax credit at the federal level, but then also the state level, we're referencing VEVRA for the purpose of protected veteran. But in those 4 categories, it's nuanced. Sometimes it might be the HR department deciding this, or compliance, so our lawyers, or the tax team. And then in the modern era, especially over the past 5-6 years, as we start migrating these efforts to diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes that adds a fourth group making a decision. And some employers are actually, for the purposes of their tax credits, defining only one category of protected veteran status because it's the easiest to define. And they might have just assessed that if they're not government contractors, and government contractors don't have this problem, but certainly finance institutions might, that they're using only one definition. And as Steph mentioned, if you bring in veterans to that process, they could quickly reference a DD 214 and tell you in seconds what each of those other three categories might be. And as it pertains to disability, it further complicates things because the veteran may have a disability assigned to them by the Department of Veterans Affairs, but they might have a disability outside the VA. So we're also looking at like ADA laws as well, so Americans with Disabilities Act. So it gets complicated, and sometimes people have streamlined that process to define a veteran for those tracking purposes within 3 years of separating from active duty. But I think that we're really narrowing the scope. And again, when we do that, if the job we're trying to hire for requires a bachelor's degree or higher, we're biasing our results primarily to retirees, so those senior enlisted and officers, or junior officers as they're separating. And as Steph so clearly articulated, we're literally fishing outside of the 80% of transitioning service members. Primarily, that population will transition within 6 years of separating from uniform, have their bachelor's degree or even higher in that case. So we're narrowing our pool by doing that.
We've been talking about the big transition, the transition from wearing a uniform to being a civilian that's either in school or employed, or in school and then employed. But nobody knows transitions more and better than military spouses. I was raised in an Army family, and my mother did 19 PCSs. So, geographic moves from one location to another. And as we talk about underemployment of veterans, we live in a two-income household society, really. So, underemployment is one thing as long as one of the spouses can help carry the load until veteran employment improves to exceed his or her civilian peers. But we know that military spouse employment is also really problematic. So when the family transitions out of uniform, that military spouse employment has been taking a hit throughout their time in military service. Eddie, I'm going to turn to you now. What can you tell us about military spouse employment? And it feels like we're the same place that we were 20 years ago with this issue. Why aren't we digging in and getting better on this?
Yeah, Meg, thanks so much. It's a great question. And I'm going to jump back to something that Jared said in regards to defining a veteran. Try defining a military spouse because you really are looking at such a large, diverse population. It is a challenge. I'm a military spouse myself. And, you mentioned your PCSs. We're getting ready to PCS in 3 months. We think we know where we're going, but we don't know yet. But we know we're leaving in 3 months. So how, as a military spouse, and Eddie Menser is not the perfect example. I've been around the military my entire life. I grew up as a military child. I started working for the Department of Defense as a civilian the day after I graduated high school. I've been a military spouse for 21 years. But when you look at the population that both Steph and Jared and even Danny talked about, that same age demographic represents a large number of military spouses as well. So how does a young military spouse especially navigate those transitions and navigate the relocations that are generally going to be across state lines, sometimes even overseas? That navigation process is so difficult. We talk about the service member navigating transition away from the military. The military spouse is literally navigating transition every 2 or 3 years. And you bring up a great question, Megan. Why do the numbers look the same? Steph started it off and Jared hit it again. As we look at the service members that transition, and we know that the vast majority of service members are not going to serve in the military for 20 years. They're not going to be around for retirement. The military spouse community is exactly the same way because they're going to follow their service member away from service. So we are always, when we look at, let's say generally about 1 million military spouses across the active and reserve components, on an annual basis, we're transitioning in and out about 10% of that population. So we're always starting every year with a brand new group of military spouses who have probably not a lot of military experience, if any, and so many competing challenges for those individuals in regards to moving to a new location, figuring out what this little ID card means that I have to use to get anything at all, and sometimes employment isn't the priority. It only becomes a priority when it matters and when you want to be employed. So I always think of when I look at the department, and right now, 2019, we were sitting at a 22% unemployment rate for military spouses, and that number has remained the same for a decade. Relatively the same. We see a percentage point here or there, but I think one of the big challenges is that we are always dealing with that transition of new military spouses coming in. I think if we followed a cohort of military spouses over time, that we would see a different number with an individual cohort. But we also look at the other challenges of military life and just the challenges of life in general. Having been in the military family readiness system for 30 years, one of the things that I always talk about is that take all the challenges of just being around and then exacerbate those with military. So we got to deal with all the other challenges as well. But then we've got the relocations. We're going to raise our families. We're going to raise our children. And, that may result in a career gap. So we look at the career gaps. We look at all those different issues that come into play and trying to fill those gaps. Jared and Steph and Danny all said it. How do we educate those individuals to be able to not just look at that requirement in a job description and say, 15 of those I meet the marks, but 2 of them I don't, so I'm not going to bother. That's the wrong answer. And we also have to educate employers. And that's a big piece of the spouse conundrum. When an employer looks at a resume of somebody that maybe got a degree in library science, and then they worked in childcare, and then they had a 2-year gap, and then they worked in retail, and then they had an 8-month gap in employment, and then they worked in a dental hygiene office as a receptionist. What's wrong? A typical recruiter is going to say, what's wrong with this individual? They went to school, they got a degree, they've never worked in their degree field. And they've worked in all these different places and they keep having gaps. For a lot of recruiters that don't understand military life, that starts setting off those orange and red flags. And we have to be able to educate those recruiters, to those employers, those hiring managers, of what that means. That 2-year gap may mean that the family moved to Korea and there was not an opportunity for employment. The reason that they worked in childcare was maybe they were in, Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico, and the only opportunity for employment was in childcare. So they see those different things. What we need a recruiter or an employer to think about is, a library scientist, when that the background that goes into that education, there's data, there's all of those different aspects. Somebody that worked in childcare, somebody that worked in retail, what skill set did that bring to that individual? Somebody that worked as a receptionist in a dental office. You take all that together and you've got a pretty well-rounded individual, and they can apply that skill set in a lot of different ways within a work environment. I think one of the other keys is, looking at, we know that our military members are an amazingly diverse population. And with so many employers focusing on DE&I right now, we have to recognize that our military spouses mirror that same diversity. And it's not just racial diversity, it's socioeconomic upbringing, it's ethnicity. The military spouse community mirrors that. And The other added benefit is that 91% of military spouses are female. So you bring that into the mix. And, why would an employer not look at that talent pool of military spouses who are more educated than their civilian counterparts? Why would they not look at them as an amazing talent pool to tap into?
Can I just tag on here real quick, just to say, we've done some work for the DoD to look at licensure across states, and although Eddie mentioned it, it's one of the reasons you might find that an individual takes a different job, because we have 55% of the states that do not have an expedited process for licensure in various fields, all the way from barber, cosmetology, if you will, to psychology. That we have 55% of the states who have no expedited process. You're talking anywhere from 6 months to a year to get a license, and you're going to be at a place for 2 years. So that's another example where I think we need to really think about, well, how are we, empowering these individuals to succeed and to have continuity? We're not. I think it's fair to say we're not.
Danny, thank you. I was also going to go to you to ask about the statistics, especially DEI statistics, because I know you saw different outcomes based on the demographics of your study population.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. I'm going to take a minute and walk you through some data, but first I got to couch it. So I want to couch it a little bit. I'm going to talk about two types of transitions within the employment domain. I'm going to talk about a successful transition within the employment domain, which is individuals that report being employed full-time and being satisfied in their job, the meaningful employment. They find there's career trajectories they're on, those kind of things. And then I'm going to talk about individuals who are what we would call in a problematic employment situation. They're looking for work, and they're completely dissatisfied, right? So looking for work or working full time and completely dissatisfied, because those individuals that are working full time but completely dissatisfied, that is not a good situation for their mental well-being or the overall long-term impact of that employment for them. We just need to own that. And now I'm going to jump you real quickly to some quick points. So if we think about successful, fully employed, really satisfied with their job, when we look at the 10,000 veterans that transitioned out, we have 38% within 3 months of transitioning out, reporting being in a successful place. We actually have 51% reporting being in a problematic place. Okay, well, let's take a look at almost 3 years out. That jumps, so we have 50% of folks, veterans reporting being in a successful place. And then we're down to 31% reporting problematic, but we're still at 31% is disturbing to me. Now I'm going to get to Meg's question here. If we look at females, for example, when we see them within 3 months of getting out, we have 31% of females reporting being in a successful employment domain. Compared, if you want to compare them to males, it's 39% for males in that wave one, in that first 3 months. When we get all the way to almost 3 years out, we're still below 50% for females. We're at 44%. And this is for females who are in the workforce. They're not choosing not to be in the workforce. I want to be clear on that. But that's 44% of females for 3 years out that are in the successful. And we have 42% that are in the problematic, either don't have a job or they're in a job they cannot stand. Okay, we just need to say that, right? Now, if we then take it one more step and say, well, let's look at females by race and ethnicity, as you might expect, or maybe you wouldn't expect, but we find that females from minority categories are the most likely to be in the problematic area. That is, having difficulty finding a job or being totally dissatisfied with that job and then not using their skills. And this kind of pattern regardless of what we're talking about. We could be talking about salaries. Same darn thing. I wish I could say it isn't, but it's the same kind of pattern no matter what data we look at when we look at our longitudinal data of 10,000 veterans.
So minority female veterans, Danny, then they're the most problematic? Okay, Steph, you're counseling.
No, they're in the
employers.
most problematic category. They're not problematic themselves. They're struggling.
Absolutely. But
Right.
they're
Be clear.
experiencing they're experiencing the most problematic employment situations. And thank you for that. So Steph, if female minority veterans are experiencing the most problematic employment situations, how are you engaging with employers to address this?
Yeah. So Meg and Danny, I think part of it is really understanding, to your point, like, why are they unsatisfied, right? And just preventing that. And Meg, you talked about it in the opening, a solid path to, and we say careers, not just jobs, right? A solid path to a career in the right industry with the right trajectory, the right company matters so much and prevents so many other pitfalls, right? Enables the whole family. And it starts with understanding, what does the individual want to do? And we ask the wrong question a lot, right? So as a community, we often ask veterans, and I would say outside of, folks that do what we do for our day job, but we ask them, what do you want to do when you get out of the military? And they'll regurgitate, I want to be a project manager, or, I want to, because they're hearing that from their transition prep work. But fundamentally, there's no way for them to understand what that means, right? And so we start off with, what makes your day? What's a good day at work for you? Do you like to work with people? Do you like to work with data? What do you like to do? What do you struggle with? What's on your absolute no list, right? And then we do the same thing with corporate partners. We actually go visit their work sites, right? We want to understand what's the ethos, because just like the military, I mean, gosh, you can tell a Marine from an airman, from a sailor, typically, right? We all have these different cultures. We want to make sure it's a cultural fit just as much as it's an actual fit from a role perspective. And then another kind of third wheel of the stool here is understanding, what is the pathway, right, to success. And you think about it, I can Google right now what a 20-year career in the military looks like for an infantryman. And it will tell me every 3 years what the next job is, right? It'll even tell you how much you'll make money-wise. Then you get to the civilian world, you apply for a job that you may or may not even understand what it means in an industry that's new, and you don't know what's next. I was actually really surprised by that when I transitioned into oil and gas right out of the Marine Corps. Someone asked me what I wanted to do next in the company. And I thought, you don't offer me like a small menu of options to select from. And that was very uncomfortable for me to navigate. And I certainly had a lot more experience in a network to be able to deal with that. So it starts with, we coach companies. Can you tell them, okay, so let's talk about this first job. Let's talk about what a couple options after that might be. Like, can we at least outline what the next 5 or 6 years might look like in this company and in this industry? And can we introduce them to a veteran in your organization that has walked that path, right? And so I think those kinds of things, especially for women, but really for both genders, understanding it's not just this decision, but veterans are trying to make a commitment. Right. And that's also something that's hard to coach too. Like, if this doesn't work out, this is not, you didn't sign a dotted line for 4 years, 8 years, like you did with the military, but let's take the time, right, and do our homework to make sure this is a good match.
Yeah, just to chime in here, because we did a little bit of data on why folks were dissatisfied. Right. And I think it mirrors exactly what Steph's saying here. But what we see is the two largest categories related to dissatisfaction with job. The first one being pay and benefits. And then when we dug into that, some of that is on the individual veteran not understanding, how that works in the civilian world. I mean, I think some of it is on that. Some of it is on the employer not understanding the skills and leadership that veteran is bringing, and not compensating appropriately for that. The second highest category is this ability to understand what the trajectory is for your career path. We had almost 15% of folks saying, and this is a huge issue. I don't know what's next for me. I can't figure out what's the goal here. And so I think that is really on target with what we saw with our as well. So thanks, Steph.
Real quick to comment on some of the demographics, because I think for any employer in America, commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion has been renewed over the past couple of years, and rightfully so. One of the things I just want to point out that I think is often slightly misunderstood with regard to the Department of Defense. So it is often stated, and it is true, that the Department of Defense is one of the most diverse employers in the United States. But what's really something kind of key to understand is as you break it down by rank. So for instance, if you controlled for junior enlisted persons, right? The Department of Defense on its ranks, actually, as you go up in each rank, becomes increasingly white and increasingly male. And so when we start looking at biasing our results towards retirees, you can actually not necessarily be meeting some of your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals by seeking out the transitioning force. But it's in that junior enlisted population, particularly, where we see representation on par with the United States. And it should also be noted that the Department of Defense is quite literally one of the nation's largest employers of transgendered people. And so when we start thinking about that and applying it to transition, to add to some of Danny's data with regards to the employment side of things, I just want to point out some things when they're in school. So today's student veterans are among the most successful in post-secondary education. It's really hard to kind of necessarily codify how many people are turning their GI Bill right when they get out. I sort of described that transition is nuanced and it's not exactly the same for everybody. But to give some overarching numbers, so FY 2020, the Department of Defense had about 157,000 transitioning service members. And incidentally, in that same year, 156,232 beneficiaries turned their benefits on. And that's not to say that, almost everyone that got out ran to college, but it's just to give those numbers. In FY 2019, you had nearly 165,000 separate, 168,000 turned on their GI Bill benefits. FY 2018, you had 182,000 get out, and you had 150,000 turn on their benefits. And give or take at current, there's nearly 900,000 GI Bill beneficiaries using education benefits in school right now. And of that population from a demographic perspective, it's really unique to sort of point two things out that I think are relevant. First, with our sisters in arms, female veterans, women veterans. So right now in college, about 31% of all student veterans are women veterans. Now, that doesn't seem very high when you think of how many students in higher education are women. They're the majority. But when you think about it compared to the Department of Defense, where about 18, 19%, if we take active duty guard reserve and lump all that together, are women. It's one of the quickest growing demographics in the armed forces. But if we look at all veterans alive, only about 11% of all veterans living are veterans. So to see 31% of them go back to school, we actually see an overrepresentation of women in transition who are pursuing their education using benefits, which is pretty cool. And then when we look at academic performance, broadly measured by persistence rates. So do they start school? Do they ultimately finish? Not to be confused with graduation rates, which are not necessarily as clean cut as you would think they are. But persistence rates, asking the question, do they start school? Do they graduate? In nearly every demographic category, so white women, African-American men and women, and Latino and Latinas, you are seeing that population, if they are student veterans, outperform their civilian non-veteran equivalents in their persistence to degree. So quite literally in some of our more vulnerable communities, or at least historically underrepresented communities, if they are veterans, they are succeeding their traditional civilian counterparts. The only two areas that we see a little bit of a dip are actually African-American men at the PhD level. And so when I talk about these levels, I'm talking associate's degree, bachelor's, master's, and terminal degrees at the PhD level. And we actually think it's a sampling error more than anything else. And then in addition, it's white men who are veterans at the undergraduate level. White men as veterans outperform their civilian counterparts at associates, master's, and terminal degrees. They slightly underperform their civilian equivalents. With regard to the other demographics, the Department of Defense underrepresents those communities, and notwithstanding the veteran population does too. But sort of any way that you slice the data, when we look for quote unquote, Steph mentioned it so well, we're looking for the best veterans to join our organization. Just because somebody takes a non-traditional path towards completing their education, it might be a little further removed from that transition. After a student veteran graduates, they're no longer 22, 23, 24. That's what a junior officer is. They're going to be in their late 20s, early 30s with a longer period of separation. So they've gotten a little bit more assimilated into their civilian life post-military. So they make great hires at that point.
Thank you. I'm going to do a lightning round and ask each of you, what should employers be doing? So Jared, how do they reach your population? And Steph, how do organizations find a partner as solid and strong as Next Stop if they're looking for an employment partner? Eddie, we haven't even talked about MSEP, your military spouse employment program, but to the extent that our audience is interested in the benefits of that program and how do they join, what are the next steps? And Danny, you are such a wealth of information. What should employers take away? Whether they're cautionary tales or tales of encouragement, like what's the story from the data that they should walk away with? Ready? Go.
I'll go fast real quick. I'd be remiss if you're looking for help. You can always reach out to Student Veterans of America, our website, studentveterans.org, or shoot me an email at jared, jared.lyon, Lyon at studentveterans.org, and we can help. But really, you can just do something that you're already doing. If you have a campus recruiting team, ensure that they have a military and veteran competency on that team. Ensure that you've got veterans on that team. And make sure when you're going to the campuses that you already recruit at, some of the best campuses in America, have your campus recruiters ask if they can also talk to the student veterans. That does two things. It opens up the talent that you can recruit for sure, but it also lets that school who might not realize they have hundreds of veterans realize, wow, one of the best companies in America just asked me if I can talk to student veterans. So I'd say that. And then if anyone's struggling with your definitions legally from defining a veteran, most of you are probably already members of the Direct Employers Association, and they have a
Yeah, the simple answer is reach out to probably anyone on this call and we will point you the right direction, right? As far as what's next. And I think a lot of it starts with understanding yourself as an organization and a company. Where are you right now? And wherever you are is fine, right? And where are you trying to go? And we love to help companies walk that path. And in that path, we'll often say, okay, well, we're the right organization maybe to help you with this part of the population of the military and veteran pool. But the Veteran Spouse Network, run out of UT Austin, is the right part of is the right organization to help you with the spouse population, right? And let's connect you with Jared on making sure we're tag teaming with local universities as well, right? So, typically an organization, I would say, that is working collaboratively and can tell you outcomes. Right. So can they sit down and say, and can help you understand that, okay, and we get everything from like, I just don't even know where to start to, okay, this is what we've done for the past 2 years. But we haven't been tracking it. So we don't know, to like, hey, we're pretty mature, but we want to continue to grow. So just know that I think the worst thing you can do is not ask for help, right? Or not ask someone to kind of take a look at what you're doing and make some recommendations or just work alongside you. And it should always be a unique solution, right? And I always like to have it be mutual goals that we're working on together, because it's really a two-party activity, right? The bridging the gap, and then also the employment and retention piece. So.
I'll jump in and talk a little bit about the Military Spouse Employment Partnership. But the first thing I want to say is one of the worst questions I hear from employers is, what jobs do military spouses want? It makes me cringe, because if you were going to a population of 1 million people, you wouldn't say, what jobs do you want? Because 1 million people are going to represent a lot of different desires when it comes to employment. There's going to be individuals that are looking for part-time work. There's going to be individuals that want full-time work. There's going to be entry level, and there's going to be senior corporate VP level. And that represents the military spouse population. So it's not what kind of jobs do you want, it's what kind of jobs do you have? because I can guarantee you, I can find you a military spouse that not only wants that job, but is qualified for that job. So the military spouse employment partnership is where employers can connect to military spouses. Today, we have more than 540 employers in what we refer to as MSEP. And those employer partners represent Fortune 20 companies, nonprofits, federal agencies, and over a 10-year period, they have hired more than 220,000 military spouses. That gets back to part of that earlier conversation. Well, God, if they've hired 220,000, why is the unemployment rate still 22%? And it's because of that ongoing transition of military spouses. But so how does an employer partner, or how does an employer become a partner with the DoD in this endeavor? You can go to MSEP Jobs, that's MSEP Jobs.militaryonesource.mil, and that will show you all of the process for applying to be a partner. We do vet every one of our partners that come through, but part of that vetting process is also part of an education process for the employer partner. So we have, everything from, like I said, Fortune 20 companies down to small businesses that may have specific programs designed for military spouses, or may be in a military impacted community that, where military spouses are looking for employment opportunities. So it covers the entire gamut of potential employer partners. I think the best part of it is that ability to connect with vetted military spouses. So we have a job board where all of those employment opportunities are posted by our partners. This morning when I went in, there were about 410,000 employment opportunities. Now, those aren't exclusive to military spouses. We have to recognize that. And we also understand that we're not asking a company to only hire military spouses. What we're asking is that an employer consider military spouses, that an employer understand the challenges that military spouses face, that an employer understands that resume, so that when that resume comes across the desk, the recruiter doesn't just throw it in the trash. The recruiter says, I wonder if this individual is a military spouse. And then they can start to learn more about that individual. And that's really where it comes together. I think one of the neatest parts of MSEP that we've introduced in the last couple of years is what we call the reverse candidate search, where an employer is able to go in and look through opted in military spouses. And we have more than 100,000 military spouses that have opted in for their profiles to be searchable. So now the employer can say, I have an opportunity that's remote, or I have an opportunity in a specific location. Let me see which spouses might be interested and might be qualified for that opportunity. And we've literally seen military spouses that have been cold called by employers, and it's resulted in jobs offered. And that's really exciting when we can see that type of connection. One other thing I'll add is that remote jobs are definitely something that military spouses are looking for. And I think that is one of the silver linings of the last 2.5 years of the global pandemic, is that more organizations have realized that remote opportunities are a possibility. And I have to point to myself as an example of this. We currently live in Montgomery, Alabama, where my wife is the wing commander at Maxwell Air Force Base. And I've been working remotely for the Office of the Secretary of Defense for the last 2 years. And quite frankly, 2 years ago, that was not an option. That would not happen. And the fact that even the DoD and the large bureaucracy that we're in can see the opportunity to make this happen. I know other employers see that opportunity as well. When you have traditionally thought about the military spouse that, they're only going to be there for 2 years. Why would I invest in them? With the idea that remote work is a potential possibility, you invest with them, and I guarantee you that they are going to be so committed that they're going to continue to be with you in the long haul.
Eddie, I'm especially glad to hear that OSD is walking the walk, because you're absolutely right. When I was in the Pentagon and OSD, in the last administration, that wouldn't have been possible.
I will not say it didn't come with some pain points, but we've made it happen. And, like I said, we're getting ready to PCS in 3 months. and we're not going back to DC. So, the opportunity continues.
That's great.
And I'll
Danny?
just be quick because I know we're almost out of time, and just say, in thinking about it, I think you've heard some really good things, but the point I would take is we know that if you just use retention, 60% of our folks left their job within a year because it wasn't a good fit for whatever reason. Part of that is on them, but part of that is on us not asking the right questions, to Eddie's point, and really thinking about the skills and leadership and sort of those intangible these folks bring, and really plugging them the right way. And I don't think we're doing that. And it's clear to me when I look at the data, that's what's shouting. So I'll stop there.
Any last thoughts anybody would like to offer before we close?
Just a thanks for the genuine interest, right? This is such a talented set of populations that we're talking about, and they have so much to offer. And if you put your heads together, and get the right people in the room, I think you'll make a big impact for your company and for this population.
Very well said, Steph. Oh,
I think one thing that any employer should consider when it comes to military spouses is, we've got two people that, are veterans here with us. And the one known in military life is that you will leave the military at some point. Everything else is up in the air. I mean, everything else is up in the air, but you will leave the military. So thinking about the potential of recruiting that veteran, that transitioning service member down the road, what a great way to make that family aware of the employment opportunities within your organization than to employ a military spouse first. Because if you employ that military spouse, that family is going to understand the commitment of your organization, of your company, to the veteran and serving military spouse population. And it's a great inroad to being able to snatch that veteran later on when they do transition away from the military. So, think about not just the tactical, think about the strategic as well.
Yeah, and to your point, Eddie, make sure your veteran resource groups invite all those that have an affinity for the veteran space. So including parents, spouses, aunts and uncles. We've seen a lot of success with that. And technically a veteran spouse or a military spouse too. So I can attest to all you shared.
Now I'm going to piggyback on Steph on that one. And remember, a veteran is not the same thing as a military spouse. And we see a lot of major benefit in organizations that have employee resource groups that are focused on veterans. But if military spouses are captured in the fine print, that's not a military spouse employment resource group. And so, the bang for the buck is in having those military spouse ERGs as well. And then to go back to Jared earlier, use your spouses you employ. They are your best conduit into that talent pool because it is a small network, and military spouses share opportunities, and they're not going to want to bring in a military spouse that's not going to produce because that military spouse represents them. So, your best recruiter, and I've heard this from many employers, your best recruiter in the spouse community is a spouse that you already employ.
Meg, if I could just piggyback off both Eddie and Steph, who have made excellent points. I think what resonates for me of those points is the word inclusive. And so, oftentimes in our community over the better part of the last 2 decades, we've heard about military and veteran friendly. Friendly is not really a measurable metric per se, but inclusivity is, and inclusivity matters in our institutions of higher learning and in our companies and in the federal government, our state governments. As we think about inclusive language, I'd encourage folks to try to think through their military and veteran inclusion strategy. Because really, as Steph and Eddie have so eloquently said, bringing everybody into the fold matters. And as an example, in your ERGs, I don't identify as somebody who's a member of the LGBTQ community. But if I was working at your company and I wanted to swing by and be an ally at that ERG, I'd be welcomed and I'd be a voice as part of that. It's the same thing with the veteran and the military community as well. And so it is one big tent, And even if you're not directly affiliated with our population, you can absolutely be a supporter or an ally. And if we take that approach to our ERGs, our community work, our corporate social responsibility work, then we have the opportunity to cast the widest net to bring our population in. And when we do, make sure that they feel included as well.
Thank you. And thank you to all our impressive panelists. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. My sense is that you're at least intrigued by military and veteran spouse employment, or you would not have joined us today. I hope that this panel added to both your expertise and also your practical toolkit for how to proceed and how to shift from being friendly to this community to being inclusive to this community. Thank you, everyone.